recording because I'm going to be out tomorrow, so I got to have this recorded today. Hi, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of week 14. We are reviewing for your module 3 assessment, okay? So that module 3 assessment is going to be over module 3, lesson 1, module 3, lesson 2, module 3, lesson 3, okay? As I mentioned earlier, progress grades are posted. So please, IC is where it's posted, but Canvas, there's been a little bit of a pass back issue because of the network. So Canvas is, if you've turned things in since the progress grades are posted, Canvas is going to be your most accurate grade. But IC is accurate. I just did them this morning. So please take a look. You know if you're failing. I don't know what else to say other than get in your work. You know what I mean? And I'll show you today again what's open. I can't pass you unless you submit work. You guys know it's that simple, and you need this class to graduate. So let's get on it. Yesterday we went over the civics exam, or last time we met, we went over the civics exam. So we did some of that review. Please don't stress about it. But again, it is something you need to do for graduation. So next week I'll bring it up. So if you have time this weekend, get it done. It isn't due till the week of Thanksgiving though. Okay. So I will readdress it next week. And then the week of Thanksgiving, that is your main thing that you need to get done, right? 35 out of 50. It is required. You can take as many times as you need, that 70% minimum or better, to meet that graduation requirement. Any questions on the civics exam? If you missed yesterday, then you can go back. That video is posted on the week 14 page, right? The lesson and recording week 14 page, where I spent the whole time, right, going over all the details. So if you missed class, then please go back and take a look at that. Okay. Before we get into our review, weekend, yay, who doesn't love a 3-day weekend? But it's Veterans Day this Saturday. So the reason we get a 3-day weekend, we're observing, it's Veterans Day on Saturday, but we're observing it, aka we get a day off on Friday and stuff. So I really quickly, I think it's easy to kind of forget or just not really pay attention. What are we celebrating when we have Veterans Day? Anybody? Can we put it in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute? What is Veterans Day? Who are we celebrating or acknowledging when we do veterans? Okay, so great. So what is a veteran? I guess that's maybe what I should have done. Okay, yes, we're celebrating veterans. So who are they? Let's be a little more specific. Yes, you're right. We're celebrating veterans, but what is a veteran, I guess? Great. Awesome. Yes. Very good. Thank you, Saisha. Yes. So people who have served in the military, right? And this is past, present, people who have died in the line of duty or came back from, deployment, anything like that, and stuff. So it's a chance to stop and recognize all the branches of the military and anyone who has or is currently serving or who has lost their life in service to this country, It's something we all know, but again, sometimes we take for granted the gravity of what that really means to go and be deployed somewhere in a war zone, or to be away from your family for a year, or to literally the ultimate sacrifice, lose your life, or to come back from a deployment with lifelong struggles, PTSD, or maybe physical injuries, or, a traumatic brain, there's so many things that can happen that don't stay on the battlefield, right? That don't stay on the deployment, that come back with you, and then, they have for the rest of their lives, and stuff. So I think it's just good to stop for a second and really think about it. I want to show you this quick video, and then we'll get right into our review.
Pressure doesn't break you. It feeds you.
Well, my name is James Dollar. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, and I served from 1990 to 2016. Well, Veterans Day originally came out of World War I. America had lost 116,000 men in that conflict. This is war on a scale that had not been seen by the rest of the world ever. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed that ended hostilities in Europe. A year later, on the anniversary, President Woodrow Wilson declared that there would be Armistice Day, and that we would remember the sacrifices of the men that served and their bravery and appreciate the victory. This was done with parades and ceremonies, and there was a 2-minute cessation of business at 11 a.m. In 1926, the Congress decided that they would make a formal declaration. It was not just a celebration of the soldiers that served in World War I, it was a celebration of peace, and it was actually a peace holiday. Of course, it was a little early because in 1939, World War II began. And in 1954, President Eisenhower In order to recognize the service of all those who served in World War II and Korea, changed it to Veterans Day. The last addition to it was in 2016, President Obama signed a Veterans Day moment of silence, so that at 3:11 in the afternoon, there's supposed to be a 2-minute of silence recognized by the United States people. Here in America, we are blessed with prosperity and freedom, but what we are often short of is gratitude. It's an opportunity to reach out and thank those people who guaranteed those safeties, that prosperity, and freedoms.
Okay, so just wanted to show that really quick. I love his last line. I think we enjoy the freedoms, we enjoy the liberties we have, and we go out, we do our thing, and the ability for freedom of speech and freedom of protest, religion, all these different things that we have, through our Constitution and that are protected and stuff like that. But often we forget the price that goes into them. It's easy to take it for granted, myself included. So I just want to encourage you, if you know anybody that has served, that is currently serving in your family or extended family, or maybe friends or relatives, anything like that, a simple text, send them something on Instagram or, social media, or a phone call. It means a lot. It really does. My father-in-law served in Vietnam. And so I always send a text or something, and he is a guy, one of the hardest men I know, not super affectionate or loving, things like that. And my mother-in-law said he always tears up when he gets those texts, because it will never leave him. And, that service that he did and stuff, and the scars that he carries. So it just helps when people acknowledge them, even if it's in a small way. Okay. So if you're able to, I think it goes a long way, and it's just the right thing to do, when it's never bad to do the right thing. You know what I mean? So, all right. We are going to review Module 3, Lesson 1. I got a short video for each one. We're going to view each module because it's been a minute. We did 2 of these before the network went out. And then we did Module 3, Lesson 3 last week. But it's easy to kind of forget. So do a little review, and then I have Kahoots, and then you have your big review sheet, okay, that you can use. They say with each day after you have material, by the time you get a couple weeks out, you retain less than 10% of what you learned. So that's why it is really important when you're going to take an assessment, why it's important to study and to review before you do it. Because especially if there's been a gap in time, which we had even more of a gap, right, because of the network issues and stuff, it's really important to have that review. Okay, so Module 3, Lesson 1 was about equal protections, okay? So justice for all, and the process we went through of trying to actually secure that, right? Like, what does actual equal protections mean? And we know we didn't start that way, right? We didn't start that way. We had the Bill of Rights, but we had slavery. Women, people of, different races and genders, right, were not given the same protections under the original Constitution. And it's been a journey, and it will continue to be a journey to have that equal protection. And when we say all, that we actually mean all, and not just, dissecting that into really white men, okay? So here's a good video, kind of sums it up.
Wix.
And
Do you
then
really?
we'll move to the next.
First up, we've got
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to finally get into why many people, including me, think that the 14th Amendment is the most important part of the Constitution. At the same time, we'll attempt successfully, I hope, to unravel the difference between civil liberties and civil rights, and also try to figure out how the Supreme Court actually looks at civil rights and civil liberties cases. So that's a lot. Let's get this out of the way, because we're not going to have time later. Let's get started. So we've been talking a lot in the past few episodes about civil liberties, the protections that citizens have against the government interfering in their lives. Civil rights are different in that they are primarily about the ways that citizens, often through laws, can treat other groups of citizens differently, which usually means unfairly. Civil rights protections grow out of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which reads, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." This may seem straightforward, and in some of the landmark cases that we'll get into, like Brown versus Board of Education, it is, but when you think about it, unequal treatment treatment of specific groups is usually done by private citizens or institutions, like your employer or your landlord. And most people, believe it or not, are not employed by the government, either federal or state, and they don't live in government housing. And initially, the Supreme Court interpreted the clause to apply only to the state government, not to private discrimination. In the civil rights cases, the court ruled that the law could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality. And they confirmed that as long as the state provided equal accommodations for people of different races, segregation was fine. This is the infamous separate but equal doctrine that was formulated in the case Plessy versus Ferguson. The distinction between social and political equality is an important one, and it provides a principle for looking at discrimination that the courts still use. Unfortunately, it's pretty complicated, and it means that we have to look at something that's kind of confusing: levels of scrutiny and protected classes. And we'll start with protected classes because they're easier to understand. Let's go to the thought bubble. So, when state law or executive action mentions a protected class, the Supreme Court will almost automatically become suspicious. So what are protected classes? Broadly speaking, they are what we might think of as minorities, and this is an important way to conceptualize them. The court defined protected classes in one of the most important footnotes in their jurisprudence. Here's the relevant passage. Nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at particular religious or national or racial minorities, whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition, which tends seriously to curtail the operation of those political processes ordinarily to be relied upon to protect minorities, and which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. So here it lays out the categories where the court is going to pay special attention when a statute deals with discrete and insular minorities, such as religious or national or racial minorities. It's automatically suspect, and the courts are going to look at it closely. Why? Well, this is in the footnote too. It's because minorities, by definition, are at a huge disadvantage in the democratic political process. Their numbers are too small to pass laws that might favor them, and it's easy for groups in the majority to pass laws that will disadvantage groups that are not in the majority. And this gets at the heart of the distinction between civil liberties, which deal with government actions, and civil rights, which deal with majority groups making life hard for minority groups. You may not like this distinction, but it does have the virtue of being based on a principle. Basically, the courts will step in to protect groups that are unable to protect themselves in the legislative process because it will be too hard for them to pass laws in their favor. The way politics works in the US will complicate this, as we'll see, but as a principle, it does make some sense. Thanks, Thought Bubble. That footnote above talks about situations that call for a more searching judicial inquiry. This is known as the level of scrutiny that the courts will apply, and it's not strictly limited to equal protection cases, but this is where I'm going to try to make sense of it. So the highest level of scrutiny is called strict scrutiny. I'd call it super scrutiny, or mega monster scrutiny, but they didn't ask me, did they? And this means that the government will have a heavy burden to prove that the law or action in question is allowable. When government action concerns a protected class, strict scrutiny kicks in. There's a 5-step process that the courts go through in examining what the government has done. First, they look to see if there's a protected liberty at stake. Sometimes this is easy, as with religious freedom, but other times it's hard, as with certain property rights or privacy issues. Second, they look at whether the liberty is fundamental, which again can be complicated or not depending on what the government is doing. Freedom from incarceration is a fundamental liberty. Actually, it's basically what we mean by liberty, so the law that specifically incarcerated one group based on nationality would get strict scrutiny. Unfortunately, this did happen during World War II when Japanese Americans were interned, but it's a bad example of strict scrutiny since in that case, the court, ruling in the case of Korematsu versus US, let the government's action stand. Third, let's look at whether the law or executive action places an undue burden on the person or group in question. Let's say a state requires literacy tests for voting, which can be burdensome or not, depending on the test and how it's administered. Fourth, assuming that the first 3 qualifications are met, the courts look to see if the law in question furthers a compelling government interest. In the literacy test example, the government interest might be seen as creating an educated pool of voters, although I'm not sure this would qualify as compelling. Fifth, if the court finds that the law meets all the other criteria, it looks to see if the government action in question follows the least restrictive means of achieving the government's interest. In other words, is there a less burdensome way that the government could accomplish what it says the law accomplishes? If the answer is yes, then the law is struck down. So you can see this 5-part test is pretty, well, strict, and it's hard for the government to pass it. In practice, this means that if the court applies strict scrutiny, it means that the governmental action or law in question is probably going to be deemed unconstitutional. So that's strict scrutiny, not mega monster scrutiny. But what about those cases where the government isn't dealing with the protected class, which is much of the time? Usually the court applies what is called the rational basis standard for review. This is the lowest level of court scrutiny, and what it means is that if the government can show that it has a rational basis for its actions, the court will say they are okay. As you might expect, this gives the government a lot of leeway with its laws. In between strict scrutiny and rational basis review is something called midsize scrutiny. Nope, intermediate scrutiny. It's a harder standard to meet than rational basis, but it doesn't mean that the government usually loses, like with strict scrutiny. Why doesn't the government consult me about naming things? Okay, so now we have a sense of what civil rights are and why the courts look at civil rights cases in the way that they do. It seems like a good time for an example to help make sense of all of this, and there's no better example than the famous decision in Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Although it was not the first case to take on the issue of discrimination in education, Brown versus Board is the most important because it dealt with public schools. The issue was that Topeka had separate schools for black students and white students. Linda Brown was black, and her parents wanted her to attend the white school because it was closer to where they lived and because it was better. The schools were supposed to be equal in quality under the separate but equal doctrine, but they weren't. So after everything I've told you about how the court decides cases where protected classes are involved, in this case black people who certainly qualify as a discrete and insular minority, the interesting thing about Brown versus Board of Education is that the court pretty much ignored all of it. The reason wasn't legal or historical, it was sociological, based on the idea that separate facilities are inherently unequal because they make the minority group feel inferior to the majority group. Although the case didn't immediately bring about the end of segregated schools, many states engaged in what they called massive resistance to prevent school integration, Brown versus Board of Education is still a landmark civil rights case. It showed that the federal government could intervene in something as local as public education when racial discrimination was involved. And more important, it showed that states couldn't use race as a criterion for setting up public schools. It was the legal basis of what we know as the American Civil Rights Movement, and provided the foundation for the federal civil rights legislation of the 1960s. So I got a little into history there. Sorry about that. I know this is Crash Course Government and not Crash Course History, but with civil rights, it's kind of hard not to. That's because, unlike with civil liberties, which are pretty much defined by the Bill of Rights, the question of civil rights comes out of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which itself came about because of the Civil War and from the very beginning was a contested concept, and one whose meaning has changed over time. Because civil rights and equal protection almost by definition involve political activity and protection of minority rights, what constitutes civil rights changes over time. That's why in 2015 people talk about same-sex marriage as a defining civil rights issue when 30 years earlier it was hardly mentioned. What's really important is that we understand that civil rights and their denial have as much, if not more, to do with us and how we treat each other as they have to do with how the government acts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with
Okay, so he does a good job of just, again, civil liberties versus civil rights. And a lot of Supreme Court cases and amendments to the Constitution, right, have been ways of adjusting and amending the Constitution to uphold civil rights, okay? And stuff where definitely the Constitution originally did not have those things in place. So over time, we've seen those adjustments made, okay? All right, let's move on. And we will take a look at Module 3, Lesson 2. So judicial activism versus judicial restraint. So we looked on one side of like defining civil rights, civil liberties, now looking at the court sides. And this is where we looked at a lot of those court cases. And when judges are using judicial activism where they are more interpreting the Constitution and then acting on it versus judicial restraint where it shows more literal interpretation. So there's cases where we definitely see both. Brown versus Board of Education was judicial activism, right? Interpreting the 13th, 14th Amendment in particular and saying, you know, what does that actually mean to be free and to be equal? And saying, no, separate but equal is not equal. Equal is equal and removal of segregation, okay? So again, looking at those cases, and then that's why we did our project. So we'll watch this review video and then we'll keep going.
When it starts to get hot, call Johnny on the spot.
If you have an hour this week, you can learn 100 songs on the piano by learning just 4 chords. These.
Hello, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to look at the Supreme Court from a different angle. We're going to try to get inside the justices' heads. Not literally, obviously, but we're going to look at the factors that influence the way they decide cases other than the structure of the court system. So we're pretty far away from the Constitution here, and straddling the nebulous worlds of government, politics, and dare I say it, history. Justices, especially on the Supreme Court, are supposed to be independent, but that doesn't mean they make their decisions in a vacuum. They make them in an office, just like most people who work. More importantly, they're influenced by a number of factors other than the case that's in front of them. In terms of their role in government, justices might be influenced by Congress because they know that, unless the case involves the Constitution directly, Congress can respond to a decision overturning a law by passing a new law. Once justices have been selected and confirmed, the president has minimal effect on judicial decisions, although he is somewhat influential on lower court justices who might someday want to be on the Supreme Court. So you lower court justices, you be nice to that prezi, okay? Knowing that the president makes the call on who gets to be a justice, with the help of the Senate, of course, federal judges might make rulings that are more likely to get them considered for the court. Since the president only serves 8 years maximum, though, it's hard for judges to know who will be president when a vacancy on the court opens up, so the president isn't much of a factor. Much more influential influential on justices is history, which works in two ways. First, the principles of precedent and stare decisis constrain the possible decisions that justices can make. Second, and more historical in the sense we think of history, justices know that their decisions will be studied by generations of historians and lawyers and YouTube viewers, and they are very well aware that some decisions, like Dred Scott, Brown versus Board, and Roe versus Wade, can have an enormous impact on American history. And now the historical stakes are even higher because they know that their decisions will be talked about by a bearded balding man on YouTube. Forever. Judges may behave strategically and consider the way that their decisions will be implemented by the executive branch, or how a part of one decision will lay the foundation for a change in the law in a decision later. Although it isn't supposed to matter, judges are influenced by their political ideology, whether they're liberal or conservative, or possibly by their party affiliation, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, or the Tea Party, or the Green Party, or their party animals like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Party affiliation and political ideology are certainly important in the selection process. It's pretty rare that a Democratic president selects a Republican judge to be on the Supreme Court, especially these days, although sometimes it happens that a justice turns out to be more or less conservative or liberal than the president thought. Former Justice David Souter is a good example of a judge appointed by a Republican who turned out to be much more to the liking of Democrats. Finally, and perhaps most important, judges are influenced by their philosophical orientation. By this I mean their judicial philosophy, not whether they're existentialists or logical positivists. While I'm sure that there are many judicial philosophies out there, the two which matter most, at least in terms of the way commentators talk about the court, are judicial activism and judicial restraint. Let's not show any restraint in actively going to the thought bubble right now. Judicial activism is the idea that the court should act as an instrument of policy, making it much more like the other two branches of government. Judicial activists tend to look beyond the text of the Constitution and statutes to consider the broader social implications of the decisions they render. Activist judges are supposedly eager to overturn congressional legislation to further their policy goals, and they're often accused by opponents of making law from the bench. Judicial activism is often associated with liberal or democratic justices, but it's not that simple. Judicial restraint, as the name implies, is the idea that judges should pay close attention to the precedent when they make their decisions, and that any changes that they make to the law should be incremental. They are the judicial tortoises to the activist hares. Judicial restraint is sometimes confused with originalism, the idea that any new law should be interpreted in the light of the Constitution as it was written in 1787. Basically, what would James Madison do orientation. Although advocates of judicial restraint often rely on the Constitution's text, it's later precedent that restrains them more than the Constitution does. Judicial restraint is often equated with conservatism, which makes sense as conservatives generally are against change, but as with judicial activism, the equivalence isn't perfect. The two different philosophies are each associated with different historical moments. The high tide of judicial activism occurred between the 50s and the mid-70s when Earl Warren and Warren Burger were the chief justices. During this time, the court made important decisions expanding civil rights, voting rights, the right to privacy, and the rights of people accused of crimes. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, the court led by William Rehnquist was known for its judicial restraint, dialing back civil rights, affirmative action, and desegregation programs, and attempting to rein in the power of the national government and devolve some power back to the states. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So a minute ago I said that activism wasn't the same as political liberalism and restraint wasn't the same as conservatism. Let me try to explain what I meant. Mainly the issue here is the claim that conservative justices practice judicial restraint. If you've been paying attention to the court recently, you'll see that this isn't always the case. The current Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Roberts, has 5 generally conservative justices and 4 that are usually considered liberal. The conservatives were all appointed by Republican presidents and the liberals by Democratic presidents. These conservative justices have been pretty activist in some of their decisions, however. For example, the Citizens United case broke with previous precedent and allowed much more campaign fundraising than prior court decisions had, which is something that political conservatives wanted. Recently, the Roberts Court invalidated parts of the Voting Rights Act, which had been passed originally in 1965 and renewed by Congress in 2010. Here's why this is problematic. One of the core tenets of judicial restraint is that courts are not supposed to overturn the decisions of a democratically elected Congress in order to make policy, unless Congress has passed laws that are clearly unconstitutional. It can work the other way, too. While the Warren Court was generally pretty activist and stocked with politically liberal justices, Justice Breyer, who is usually considered politically liberal and was appointed by a Democrat, believes that judicial change should be incremental and doesn't want to make decisions that will cause sweeping changes. So he's exercising judicial restraint. So I'm going to stop here, otherwise we're going to fall into the trap of talking politics, and I don't want to do that with him around because he's always trying to sue American Eagle Apparel for violating his right of publicity, and I think it's fine. They've had that trademark for quite some time. I'm sorry, but you don't really have those rights. You're not human or even a real eagle. So let me just remind you of a few things in an attempt to be as clear as possible. First, judicial philosophy is not the same thing as political ideology, even though the media, especially the television media, likes to say they are. Judicial philosophy refers to activism and restraint, while political ideology refers to liberalism or conservatism. It's possible to be both politically conservative and judicially activist, and vice versa. Second, there's lots of factors that influence the way judges make decisions, and the judges rarely let you know which one is at work. Whenever you look at a court decision, which we're going to do soon, think about which factors went into that decision, especially especially the way that Congress and the executive will react to it. Remember, despite what you may hear, all decisions are highly political, except the decision to end this video. Thanks for watching. See you next week. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with
Okay, so module 1 was module 3, lesson 1 was civil liberties versus civil rights, and looking those examples and what was the Constitution lacking and what changes have we made, right, over time to uphold not just civil liberties, but civil rights for all. Then we looked in module 3, lesson 2, and we looked at how the court's been a part of that, right? So what role has the courts had in civil liberties and civil rights, okay? So sometimes that means the courts do what's called judicial activism, right? Where they make a change. They interpret maybe the Constitution or legislative differently than it has been in the past. So it brings about change, okay? They're taking an active role in the change based on their interpretation. But sometimes judges uphold what already exists. So maybe a right or a situation is called into question, and that judge then refers to the constitutional laws and says, no, based on the laws or based on the Constitution, this is the boundaries, or this is the way this case should be solved. So sometimes judges use judicial activism, and they interpret and maybe make change where they see fit or where society sees fit. Or sometimes judges are upholding what already exists. So maybe a good example of upholding would be Tinker versus Des Moines, right? The student freedom of speech, you write the armbands, so the school saying they didn't have the right, and the judge using restraint saying, no, according to the definition of the Constitution and how we define this in students, having an armband is not impeding the educational environment and is upheld under their the First Amendment rights, freedom of expression, right? So and stuff. So both are important. We need activism sometimes, and sometimes we need restraint, to protect people's rights. So both cases are important. All right. And then this last week, we looked at how do we balance majority rule versus minority rights. Okay. And that's a hard balance to strike. But the reality is the only kind of government that can actually do that is a democratic republic, right? Where the majority gets to elect the officials that run the government. But then also with the Constitution, minorities in whatever that situation is, again, we said it could be race, it could be sex, it could be income, it could be education, it could be geography. There's a lot of different ways of identifying a minority group depending on the situation, okay? How are we also making sure that when majority rule has their way, that we're not doing it or it could be religion, we're not doing it at the expense of, or the sacrifice of, or the cost of the non-majority in whatever that circumstance is. And that's a hard balance to kind of gain sometimes, okay? So we see lots of cases where in the courts and things like that, where they have had to go about protecting minority groups when the majority rule, which is important, but you want to make sure both are being done. Majority rule while protecting minority rights. Okay, so we'll watch a quick video on that.
Insurance companies like to get big-name football stars to endorse their products.
Not AAA.
Outsmart athlete endorsements and choose coverage confidence from AAA.
Groups and at other times has protected those rights. It means it's time to talk. And welcome back to Heimlich History. Now we've been going through Unit 3 of the AP Government Curriculum, and in this video, that means it's time to talk about the balance between majority and minority rights. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, well, then let's get to it. So in this video, we're going to try to do two things. First, explain how the government has responded to social movements, and second, explain how the Supreme Court has at times allowed the restriction of the civil rights of minority groups and at other times has protected those rights. So just like in the last video, this is a video about civil rights and how the civil liberties outlined in the Bill of Rights have been applied to Americans, or in some cases, how they have not been equally applied. So since we already talked about the various civil rights movements in the last video, let's begin by considering how the government has responded to those movements. One of the chief goals of the civil rights movement for Black Americans was to abolish segregation in society. Now, racial segregation had been made the law of the land by a landmark Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. And as a result of that case, the court ruled that racial segregation was perfectly constitutional as long as the various facilities for Black people and white people were equal. And that was what became known known as the separate but equal doctrine. So that decision was all that some states needed to pass laws that restricted Black Americans from restaurants and public facilities, and more to the point for this video, schools. So as the devotees of the civil rights movement reminded America, this segregated situation was in no way constitutional. When it came to segregation in schools, the Black schools were certainly separate from the white schools, but they were never equal in funding. Additionally, just by the mere fact of separation, Black students and parents were made to feel like they were second-class citizens. And so the Plessy case is a prime example of the court restricting the civil rights of a minority. Well, in 1954 and 1955, a series of cases under the heading of Brown v. the Board of Education came before the court to address this inequity in the school system. Now, since this is a required case, I've got a whole video devoted to it. So here, let me just say that the Brown decision effectively overturned the separate but equal doctrine and ordered schools to be integrated. The court ruled that racial separation is inherently unequal, no matter the state of the various facilities and the staff, and they did so based on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And this is an example of the court upholding minority rights. So that's the court, but Congress also responded to these various civil rights movements as well. About a decade after the Brown decision, Congress passed two laws that upheld the rights of Black Americans. First was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal to discriminate against anyone on the basis of race. As a result of this, all the segregated facilities not covered by the Brown decision were required to integrate. Second, the next year saw the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which made it illegal to discriminate against voters. You see, before this law went into effect, several states had enacted poll taxes or literacy tests that had to be paid or passed in order to vote. And this was a thinly veiled strategy to keep Black Americans out of the voting booth. But with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment, which officially outlawed poll taxes, Congress upheld the franchise for minorities. Now, I just have to say that although all this is true on paper, it's not as though civil rights have always been upheld since then. Even so, these responses from the federal government were good steps in the right direction. Now, on the front of the women's rights movement, Congress also acted to uphold the rights of women. Front and center here was Title IX of the Education Amendments Act in 1972. Now, the need for this law grew out of a glaring omission in the Civil Rights Act. And Title VI of that law explicitly bans discrimination with respect to federally funded programs like schools. And in the language of Title VI, it says that discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin is illegal. But all the women in America sat up and were like, really sounds like you missed something there. No, we got race, color, national origin. That's all the discrimination category. Really? You can't think of one other group that has been the subject of discrimination? Yeah, I got nothing. Anyway, Title IX of the Education Amendments Act plugged up that omission from the Civil Rights Act by guaranteeing that discrimination of federally funded programs could not happen on the basis of sex as well as race. And one of the most visible outcomes of Title IX was the rise of women's sports programs in colleges. Okay, now let's discuss one other way that the government has responded to civil rights movements with respect to voting, and that has to do with the drawing of majority-minority districts. And a majority-minority district is a district in which the majority is a minority. Now remember from Unit 2 that every 10 years when the data comes in from the census, we find out where everyone is living, and congressional districts are redrawn in order to make sure that everyone is represented equally, which is to say, to make sure that every person's vote counts equally. And Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act made clear that districts could not be drawn in order to dilute the voting power of racial minorities. And that principle was upheld in the non-required case of Thornburg v. Gingles, which I confess gives me great pleasure to say. Anyway, it turned out that North Carolina had drawn 7 new districts in which it was basically impossible for Black votes to be equal with white votes. And so the court struck that down as a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, thus protecting minority rights. But the court ruled in the other way in one of your required cases called Shaw v. Reno, on which, again, I have a whole video. The short story is that North Carolina drew 2 majority-minority districts, which is to say majority Black districts, and submitted the plan to the Justice Department for approval. And based on the Voting Rights Act, the Justice Department said, sounds good to us. But several North Carolina residents challenged these districts, which, to be fair, were drawn in very wonky shapes, saying that these majority-minority districts were drawn only to help Black voters. The word for that, in case you forgot, is racial gerrymandering. Anyway, the court agreed and said that while the districts were definitely created with noble intentions, they were so bizarre that the only explanation is that they were racially motivated. And even if those districts were drawn to increase the power of Black voters, districts drawn only with race in mind were deemed unconstitutional. So that's an example of the court ruling in favor of majority rights. Okay, thanks for watching. Click right here, grab my review packet.
Okay, so then Module 3, Lesson 3, hopefully these videos look familiar to you. We've watched them before, but just good quick review. So how the government and Supreme Court work sometimes they are upholding and protecting majority rights, and then sometimes they are upholding, protecting, or changing minority rights and stuff. So the roles of the government and the court systems when you're trying to strike that balance, okay, the best that you can. It's never perfect, but we want to strive, right, to meet as many needs and its fairness as much as possible. Okay. So looking at your Module 3 assessment, okay, it's 30 questions. It'll be questions from those 3 lessons, okay? Your review sheet is right here, so let me give it to you. Okay, go ahead and click on that link. And let me know that it opens, please. Are we clicking on it? Can somebody let me know if it opens? Thank you, Elena and Amy. Okay, awesome. All right. So this is your best friend, right? Okay. It's a lot of information. So when you do the total assessment, you want to make sure that you are reviewing before you just jump in. All right. Now, I did try to break it up. I pulled from each of the review sheets. There's the key vocab. All right, if you want to go in and make adjustments, then remember you can do file, make a copy, and then you can make adjustments to the document if you wanted to add definitions or something like that, okay? So it has the main points from each side. So 3.1 has the main points. Anything in yellow, right, is the checking for understanding. Oh, here's some more of those checking for understanding. Here, let me put them in yellow. That'll be helpful, I'm assuming. All right, there's some more. Okay, checking for understanding. 3.1, so 3.2, same thing. So each section and those checking for understanding questions. So it's a good idea. Like, go through, review each section, review the key bullet points. You know, what were those checking for understanding questions? Okay, because again, those can be really helpful as they tend to be the same questions. Remember in Canvas that the checking for understanding questions program isn't working. Hopefully they're going to get it fixed. They told us they're going to get it fixed. We're still waiting. So if you're going to review those checking for understanding questions, you got to do it off the review sheet. You can't go back into the module and access them right now, unfortunately, until they fix that link or whatever is the issue with the program. Okay. Any questions on the review sheet? So remember, you can use this, right? Okay, and you can add to it if you want. You can edit it. You just make a copy to do that. All right, and then save it to your government folder. All right. So let's do a Kahoots game. Take us 10 minutes, and then I'll leave you the last 20 minutes to work on any work or try to get some work in that you need. Like I said, a lot of people in this class need to bring their grade up. So give you some time to kind of take a look through that, what's available, and what can you be working on over this longer weekend to get your grade up, okay? So let's do some Kahoots. These are pulled directly from the test bank, okay? So this is worth your time because again, this is directly from the test bank. Okay, classic mode. So open a tab or grab your phone, whatever is going to be easiest. Copy the link here. Okay, there's the link in the tab, or you can go to the Kahoots app, put in the code, or you can scan that and join. All right. This is to your benefit. This is worth a lot of points, worth 30 points in the summative category. Great way to raise your grade. All right. So please join. 10 questions, again, pulled straight from the test bank. Okay. So these are literally questions that are on the test. So this is worth your time. Thank you, Ladybug. All right. Come on, folks. Thank you, Lena.
Do you go off like how many you get correct, or you're saying like if you participate?
It's all for fun and stuff. I won't get started though until I have at least, half of you participating. Because this isn't for me, this is for you guys, right? So you know what I mean? So you get it wrong, that's okay. Obviously it's fun to make the podium, but nobody's judging, it's because it shows you the right answer and then we go over it, so that's why it's really worth participating. Okay, thank you, everybody's in there. Come on, let's get some more. We got 19 people in this meet and 4 people in the Kahoots. Come on. don't know what's going on with you guys. Like pulling teeth every day lately. Yep. Welcome to a teacher's frustration. Thank you, Kendall. Come on, you guys. Let's go. Let's go. Come on, come on. You guys are burning time. We could be starting already. Let's go. Thank you. Come on. This is where students have to take responsibility for their learning, right? I can lead you to the water. You have to drink. So, I can show you questions off the test, but you have to want to participate and do well and pass the class. So, thank you. Get one more. Come on. I know, believe me. Well, then you guys, when teachers get mad, then you guys say we're mean. And when I ask nicely, you know, people, I mean, I can't win. Come on, folks.
Honestly, you gotta bring out your mom's side. You know how when moms ask, you know how when moms ask, "Oh, hi."
I don't know if you guys can't tell. I've been getting a little annoyed this period in particular. You guys, like, I appreciate those of you who joined, but the participation is like pulling teeth in this class.
Yeah, you know, like the moms would be like, when moms ask, they're like, "Hi, can you just pick this up?" Or "Hi, can you just do better here?" And they ask nicely, and then the kids repeatedly do the same thing until they yell.
Yep. Well, I say that to my girls all the time. I'm like, if you just do it the first time, I wouldn't have to yell. No, believe me, I'm. But I'm a teacher, so I have to be professional. You know, I'm not your parent, so I can't completely yell at you. Come
My
on.
mother would not care. She would not care. She would be like, "I'm full down on her side."
All right. This is great. Let's get started. All right, answer. There's no penalty for trying, okay? It's 1 out of, 25% chance, and the goal is to see how well you know it. These are right off of the test, so these are great review, even if you don't know it. This piece of legislation banned discrimination based on race in public places and hiring. Civil Rights Act of 1964, 26th Amendment, Voting Rights Act 1965, or 14th Amendment. Take your best guess. You're not sure? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. One. Hey, it is Civil Rights Act of 1964. And look, everyone who answered it got it. Okay, good. So Civil Rights Act of 1964, kind of took the Brown versus Board of Education to the next level. And again, really pushing to end discrimination, which a lot of that was segregation and being able to use some of those barriers to say, well, this is why you can't apply, and putting up roadblocks. The Voting Rights Act was particularly, so here's again where there was an issue. The Constitution said everyone had the right to vote, but it didn't stop states from putting roadblocks. So yes, legally you could vote, but if you have to pay a poll tax, you have to pay a literacy test, they would put these obstacles, hurdles, so to speak. So a lot of this legislation is, the amendments were there, but you have to be really specific because governments were finding ways around it. Does that make sense? So sometimes you got to get really specific, and these are definitely an example of that. All right, good job. So when they score it like that, then it's when everyone gets it right, then they score it based on who answered it first. So answering quickly helps you, and then obviously getting the right answer helps you. All right, let's do the next one. Information published by the press can be limited in all the areas, in all the following cases except, okay? So it is, if it is critical of the president, if it is lascivious, if it is considered an obscenity, or if it does not pass the clear and present need. So if it is critical of the president, okay? So information by the press can be limited or kind of filtered in all the following cases if it's obscene, it's not appropriate. So if you're gonna try to publish a photo of someone naked or of someone dead, like something clearly inappropriate, if it's libelous, so meaning a lie, it's slander. Like, do you actually have something to prove it? You can't just publish anything you want. You have to have something to back it up. If it does not present clear and present danger. Critical of the president. We are allowed to be critical of the president. All right. We are allowed to be critical of the president, and that cannot be limited. Nice job. All right, here we go. There's 10 questions total. All the following are associated with post-World War II civil rights movements except, so post means after World War II. The bus boycotts, Rosa Parks, the founding of the NAACP, Martin Luther King Jr., or Brown versus Board of Education. We had this one on one of your quizzes. I knew we'd get over this. 2, 1. The founding of the NAACP. So bus boycotts that happened in bus boycotts and Martin Luther King Jr. That's part of the civil rights movement, 1950s, 1960s. Brown versus Board of Education. 1958 or 1959. I always get the year wrong. It's right there at the end of the 1950s. It says so all of those are after or post World War II. NAACP established in the 1920s. Okay, so it's been around for about 100 years. Okay, give or take about 100 years. Okay, when people assemble, the government has the right to police the speech of the protesters, end the protest for any reason, maintain order, or disrupt protesters that are critical of the government. So assembly is allowed, but where does the government have a right to intervene? In what way? In what way can the government intervene in protests? Yes, maintain order. Okay. So we've seen that with the hot topic that's going on right now, right? With Israel and Palestine. Okay. Lots of assembling going on, lots of protesting going on and stuff. So the government can't break it up per se, but they can be there to make sure that they maintain order, that it stays peaceful, right? That we're not damaging property and we're not harming each other. Okay. And we've heard of a few stories of skirmishes breaking out here and there. There was a case in California, and I know there's been a couple others and stuff where sometimes protests, do become, people interact and it can get heated. So the government, meaning like law enforcement responders, can intervene in the sense of at least trying to maintain order. So they can't keep you from protesting, but as long as you're doing it in a way that is peaceful, you know what I mean? Not harming others. Okay. Civil rights are those rights that are applied. All people 18 and over, all citizens, minority groups who have experienced discrimination, or all people in the country. So civil rights are those rights that are applied to who? Do your best. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. All citizens. Okay, so all citizens. So if you're not a citizen of a country, you still have rights, just not as many rights. Okay, so so when they say all citizens to experience the full expanse of civil rights in this country, okay, and what that's defined, because every country has their definition of civil rights, different limitations, and what that. So no two countries are the same. So to experience our full, extent of the law of civil rights, citizens enjoy that highest platform. Okay, so all citizens. So even if you're under 18. Okay. And stuff, you have, you get to exercise those rights. Now, sometimes we see it limited, right? If you are in like school or something like that, but you still have those rights. All right. It says here, Amy has the highest answer streak. All right. Nice job, everybody. Keep going. He offered words of advice and blank to be careful. So this is a vocab question. Capital, admonition, appraisal, or foe. So which is it? This is where those vocab words can be really helpful. Having them defined. Sorry, some caffeine. All right, it is admonition. Okay, so words of advice and admonition. So like warning. Like, hey, careful, tread easy. I might avoid that. It's like caution sign, words of caution. And stuff. So all right, nice job. All right. On the 3 in a row, back on top. Anybody's game. Because he committed a blank crime, the law states his sentence was punished by death. So, contemporary, admonition, or capital. We talked about this. No, you misclicked. Oh, no. You still got a few questions. It's still possible. Don't give up. Come back from behind. Capital. Okay, good. So a capital offense is like the worst crime. So like a capital offense. So murder is usually what they're talking about, a capital murder charge. And not just any murder, it would be like first degree murder. Okay. If it's second or third degree. So manslaughter is you killed somebody, but it was an accident. Like you didn't even intentionally do it. It was an accident. So maybe you got in a tussle and then they died. You're like, oh, it wasn't my intent. Second degree murder is when you intended to kill them, but there was no pre-thought. So like in the heat of the argument, you kill them or you shoot them or something like that. But it wasn't like 10 minutes earlier that was your intent. First degree murder is premeditated, meaning I thought about it, I decided, and I went and did it. So that's the capital offense. That's the highest offense, and in particular with murder. Very dark, right? It's like, ooh, even talking about it, I'm like, ooh. All right, it's a close game here. Number 8, 3 questions left. His ability was acknowledged by friends and blank alike. So, appraisal, admonition, or contemporary. Good. Foe. So just meaning circle, people around, people that know. So friends, and by foe meaning, those who know you, maybe don't necessarily even like you, when people don't necessarily like you, give you props for something or acknowledgement that you did good, right? That you're doing something right. When people who maybe tend to be critical of you are actually saying, no, you did what you're supposed to do. All right. Lena's still on top. Amy, you're right there. Alicia, Jeremiah, Ladybug. All right. 2 more. The increase in police presence is yet another minor blank of our individual liberties. Pursuit, universal, encroachment, or consent. The increase in police presence is yet another minor blank of our individual liberties, meaning freedoms. All right, so that is encroachment. So this is again where we want to review those vocab words. So encroachment means, kind of taking away or coming in, right? That's another heated debate and topic. I think most people agree we need police, but how many and where and how they patrol, right? That can be, there can be a lot of different opinions or different views on that and stuff. So when you have more police presence, it does mean things are being monitored, and maybe there's been higher crime in an area, or they're looking for a suspect, or they're questioning people, or something's happened, And so sometimes in order to get that order or to reduce crime or something like that, our individual spaces are infringed upon, And so sometimes that's appropriate, and sometimes maybe not. All right, Lena, nice job. All right, last one. Here we go. He was a blank of George Washington and often looked to him for inspiration. Wait. Okay, this is clearly, vocab word. Not a vocab word. Contemporary, capital, appraisal, or add. Two, one. Contemporary. Okay, so kind of he mirrored him. So contemporary means like a modern version. Okay, so he was a contemporary. He was kind of a modern version of George Washington. Often looked to him for inspiration. So maybe, I don't know if you've ever had like a historical figure that you really admire. You're like, I want to be like them, or they inspire you, or you kind of, guide yourself after. And stuff. The person who I did my student teaching with, he was an amazing teacher. And I would like to think that I'm a contemporary of him, that I definitely took inspiration from him. And I tried to do a lot of the same things. He basically said, if I don't love teaching 95% of the time, I'm in the wrong profession. And I agree with him, like if you don't love what you're doing most of the time, then you're doing the wrong thing, and people will know that, so I took a lot of inspiration from it. Yeah. So contemporary, meaning you try to model yourself after that, or inspired by that. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. All right. Let's see. Here comes the podium. I think we know who's going to be on top. Alicia, nice job. What a cute little penguin. Number 2, Amy. Woohoo. Cowboy penguin. And number 1. And a nice job, Wild Tiger. All right, Jeremiah Ladybug, runners up. Nice job. Nice job. Very good. Woo. Yes, very good job. Good job. Okay. Let me close this up. Yay, top 5. I'll accept it. Good, good. Okay, so we went over the Kahoots. Those are directly off. So like I said, vocab is worth your time. So if you're struggling with the vocab, go get the definitions for those. That can be really helpful and stuff, and put those in your review sheet because there's definitely some vocab questions. Okay, so you need to take your Module 3 assessment. That is your one assignment for this week. Okay, it is due on Monday the 13th. We went over the Nevada Civics exam yesterday. That isn't due till the 20th, but I would start reviewing for it. I showed you all those review materials in our last class, okay? Also take a look at what's closing. So again, checking your progress grade. And if you're under a 70%, you need to get it in gear. You need to get it up, especially if you didn't pass first quarter, right? Because those average. So if you didn't do well first quarter, then you got to get even higher second quarter to average them out, okay? Module 3, Lesson 1 notebook and quiz closes this Friday. All right. And that's after already being extended. So this will be permanent. Module 3, Lesson 2 notebook, quiz, and project close the following Friday, the 17th. And then Module 3, Lesson 3 notebook quiz, as we're due this last Monday. Those close on the 27th. Okay. So lots of opportunities for you to turn things in to get your grade up and stuff like that. All right. So we'll spend about 10 minutes. I can't let you go this early because of attendance, stuff like that. But I'm going to stop recording here in a second, but we'll give you the rest of the class period. Go and look at your grade. Look at what you're missing and make up a plan. Like, what am I going to get done so I can get my grade up? So that would be how I would spend this time. Go look at your Canvas grade. What can you turn in? Focus on quizzes. Focus on the project. Those are great ways to get your grade up pretty quickly.